on to the Penny Stamps Distinguished Speaker Series. Today we present the maven of impeccably elegant food presentation, Louise Fili. I think it most fitting to have Louise here on the eve of Valentine's weekend, so you can think of this as the Penny Stamps Series Valentine to you all. And I hope it inspires everyone to find some good company and eat something delicious this weekend. I want to thank our partners for their support of today's program, DC3, or the Detroit Creative Corridor Center, and the Michigan Radio, 91.7 FM. And I wanted to mention, I don't know how many of you have heard DC3's good news, but DC3 has successfully lobbied for Detroit to become the first American city to be named UNESCO City of Design. Yeah, it's kind of a big deal. There's over 100 UNESCO Cities of Design, and this will be the first one in the US of A. The honor of this title recognizes a city's design legacy and its commitment to promote cultural and creative industries. And design is certainly Detroit's contribution to global design is indisputable. There's a rich legacy there with such iconic names as Eames, Knoll, Bertoia, Diffriant, Rapson, Saarinen, Libeskind, Yamasaki, Kahn, Dow, Earl, scores of others. And design continues to play a significant role in our region here, both economically and culturally. So it's good for the city to get this recognition. And DC3 will be planning many events throughout this year to celebrate this designation, so stay tuned. I have one hot tip for you if you need something to do tomorrow evening. Great way to begin your weekend. The Museum of Natural History, just around the corner up the street, has a new exhibit which is opening called Extreme Time, where you can learn about deep time from femtoseconds to eons. So they have an opening reception at 5 o'clock tomorrow evening, worth checking out. Please remember to turn off your cell phones. Nicola's Books is in the lobby. They have a few of Louise's books and some pencils and note cards for sale. And we will have our regular Q&A in the screening room today directly following, so come and meet Louise. And if perchance you have a book and you wish it signed, I believe she will grant you that honor post Q&A. Now, for a proper introduction of our guest today, we have an aspiring stamps student, a junior studying art and design along with a minor at the Ross School of Business. She's focusing on graphic design, letterpress, and printmaking. Please welcome Miss Emily Schumer.
Food, type, and all things Italian. What could be a better combination? Louise Fili has successfully made this trio of delectable treats her focus. For nearly 40 years, Fili has been working with design and typography, merging the use of old and new type and lettering to find refreshing and unique results. Her efforts in the design community are unparalleled. She began her career as senior designer for Herb Lublin, worked for Random House as an art director at Pantheon Books, and over 2,000 book jackets later, founded her own New York studio, Louise Fili Limited, in 1989. Renowned graphic design historian Phil Meggs, commenting on Fili's eclectic influence on the state of design in the 80s, characterized her as one of the women who saved New York. From lettering to logo design, restaurant identity, book design, and packaging, this woman can do almost anything. She has received numerous awards and medals from the Society of Illustrators and the New York Art Directors Club, as well as 3 James Beard Award nominations. Some of her work is housed in permanent collections at the Library of Congress, the Cooper Hewitt Museum, and the Bibliothèque Nationale. She has taught and lectured on graphic design and type, co-authored many books with her husband, design historian and writer Stephen Heller, and she has written several of her own. She is a member of the Art Directors Hall of Fame and has received the Medal for Lifetime Achievement from both AIGA and the Type Directors Club. Her unmatched style and prolific career are immensely inspiring. I'm in awe of her elegant and focused design work in the pages of her monograph, Elegantissima. As a successful female designer living in New York City, Not afraid to break the rules and push boundaries, Feely is a role model for passion, drive, and exquisite skill. I am honored to introduce her tonight. Please help me welcome Louise Feely.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here. My story always starts here in Italy, which is my greatest source of inspiration, both typographic and gastronomic. I never, ever forgave my parents for having the bad judgment to leave and come to America. And the final insult was that I was born in New Jersey and had to spend the rest of my life compensating for that by traveling to Italy as often as possible, obsessively photographing signage like you see here, combing bookstores and flea markets, and of course, eating. But because I couldn't live there, I had to learn to make my own typographic oasis. So as art director of Pantheon Books, I had the great opportunity to be able to experiment with a different period of design and type history on practically a daily basis. And when I started out at Pantheon, it was sort of a grim time in publishing. There weren't a lot of risks being taken, and everyone seemed to think that type on book covers had to be big and vulgar. And I, on the other hand, was on a mission to prove that you didn't have to shout to capture someone's attention. And I think this cover that I did for The Lover was the best example of that. Marguerite Duras, although a celebrity in France, was relatively unknown in the US. And in spite of this very understated cover and the fact that she was unknown, the book became a runaway bestseller, Pantheon's first since Dr. Zhivago in 1958. So I think I proved my point. The other thing going on at that time is that in publishing was that art directors were so poorly paid that we all had to freelance for one another. So I got a call one day from a publisher that I had never worked for before, nor had I even met, who said, "We have an Italian Nazi fascist homosexual novel that's just perfect for you." So one day it would be fascist type, the next day Wiener Werkstatt. And that was the other thing that was going on, is that there were really no reference books for design or type history because Steve Heller hadn't written them yet. So I had to build my own archive by traveling to Europe as often as possible. And I would do anything I could to avoid using standard typefaces. I would take old type books and scan in alphabets and then make up the missing letters, or I would just letter something completely from scratch. And I would also, I was always looking for patterns and ornaments to go with the type. So keep your eye on this pattern, because you're going to see that coming back again later. And this is arguably the worst title in the history of book publishing, I think. The Thing Happens. 20 years later, I still can't tell you what this means, but it was actually a very good book of essays by the then film critic of the New Yorker magazine. So I decided to use these little plaster letters that were designed to make your own home movie titles in the 40s and 50s. And you'll see this coming back again later, too. So little by little, I began to realize that there was life after book publishing. And this was a poster mailer that I did for the Society of Publication Designers, which I did gratis, of course, in exchange for creative freedom, which is usually the way these things work. And since I'd always wanted to design an eye chart, this was the perfect opportunity to do that. So 11 years and 2,000 book jackets later seemed to be as good a time as any to start my own business, where I made a concerted effort to focus on the only three things I'm interested in: food, type, and all things Italian. And I quickly learned two rules about having your own business. One is that you should never depend on any one type of work or any one client. Or two, you should never sit and wait for the phone to ring. As a designer, it's incredibly important to have your own projects, because I think that's the only way that you really grow and develop your own design voice. So I started with what was closest to my heart, which was, of course, Italian Art Deco. So this was the first book in what became a series for Chronicle books on Art Deco graphic design that I did with my husband, Steve Heller. Steve and I would collect and select the work together. He would do the writing, and then we would design the book in my studio, where I had two rules about the book design. One was that we would always design our own specific font based on some image in the book. And the second was that we would always show a woman on the cover, which was easy enough until we got to Germany, where they preferred to glorify the Aryan male instead. But eventually I was able to find this redheaded Fraulein. So books did very well, but eventually they all drifted into remainder purgatory. And but fortunately, we were able to extract a segment of each of the books, except for American Streamline, and put them into this hardcover, which happily is still in print. And then from there, we did many others: typology, type design from the Victorian age to the digital era, design connoisseur, and many, many others. So what I began to find, though, is that after all these years of focusing on book covers, it was nice to finally do interiors of books as well. Except there was one aspect of book design that really irked me, and that was the copyright page. A lot of people don't even notice copyright pages, but it is one of the first typographic treatments that a reader will see when opening a book. It's usually on page 4. And it's a lot of legal and technical information that has to be set, supposedly, line for line, exactly the way it's given to you. And doing that makes for a very, very dull-looking design. And I was convinced that there had to be a better way to do that. So one day I was working on a book about gardening, and I set the copyright information in centered lines. And I looked at it and I thought, you know, with just a few little tweaks, this could look like a tree. So I made some changes. I tried it out on my son, who was 2 years old at the time, and he got it. So I figured I was home free. But then I had to deal with the copy editor, and they like to go by the rules. So we had a whole back and forth going on. She said, no, 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 it can't be done. It's against the rules. And then I produced historical examples, because I certainly wasn't the first person to ever contour type. I showed Marinetti and Apollinaire. And finally, I got the publisher on my side, and I won the battle. And having one under my belt made it much easier for the next publisher. This was a different publisher, but when I said, oh, well, this other publisher said yes, so then it was easier. So this was a book of poems to Edward Lear, a very quirky book called You Can't Be Too Careful. It was an Englishman who had collected newspaper clippings of strange ways that people had died. Aperitif. This was with my friend Art Spiegelman. It was a book called Wild Party. This was a book on the best tea shops in the UK. Lost Words of Love. Writing New York. I was very lucky to have the Empire State Building right outside my window when I was working on this. And I'd always wanted to build the Eiffel Tower out of type, so I was very thrilled to do this book on historic shops and restaurants of Paris. A book of photographs of the Twin Towers. And I think the only reason that I agreed to do this book of photographs of volcanoes was so I could do this copyright page. Cuban Deco. And a series of cookbooks, one on chilies and one on beans. And this is a baking book for my client, Sarah Beth. She just did a new book on breakfast and brunch. This is a guidebook I did to Florence. And hopefully you can see the gray stitching on this. This was a book of essays on baseball. And this was the strangest one of all. This was a book on the effects of Nazism on the practice of dermatology, but it made for an interesting copyright page. So having grown up in an Italian-American household where the main topic of conversation every morning was what to make for dinner, it should have come as no surprise to me that I would end up working in the food industry. This was actually a poster that I did many years ago for a talk that I gave in Cincinnati. I had been to Cincinnati one time before this to judge a design competition, and all I remember is that I had to fly out there very early in the morning. I was whisked away from the airport to this beautiful Art Deco office building, to the basement where the judging was being held. And I kept asking if I could get a cappuccino, and it became a running joke because there was no cappuccino to be had at this time in Cincinnati. So a couple of months later, I got a phone call from the president of the Cincinnati Art Directors Club to invite me to come give this lecture. And the first thing he said when I answered the phone was, "Louise, we have cappuccino in Cincinnati now." So I decided to make that the theme, of my poster. And when I look back on this, I realize what an artifact it actually is, because not only was this poster done pre-Photoshop, and if you had about an hour, I could explain to you how we actually produced this. But in short, we printed out the type, had to cut it all apart and paste it onto a saucer, photograph it, then give it to my retoucher, who had to airbrush out all the cut lines. That was just the beginning of it. So anyway, not only was this done pre-Photoshop, but it was also pre-Starbucks. Can you imagine a time without either of those? So I decided to embrace the curious world of restaurants, and I quickly learned that in New York City, restaurants are the #1 business most likely to fail. I also found myself dealing with a class of client that was about this far from gangsterdom, but on the other hand, I always had a table. So, until they closed. So I started out doing a lot of restaurants doing logos for a lot of restaurants that had unpronounceable French names that were owned by people who were neither French nor could they even speak French. So we started with this one, Prix Fixe, and then Espace was a French bistro. I decided I wanted the logo to look like a classic enamel sign for a French bistro, and I actually convinced the client to let me have an enamel sign made for the restaurant. So when the restaurant closed, which is the punchline you'll be hearing a lot tonight, when the restaurant closed, I got to keep the enamel sign, so it was win-win. So imagine a restaurant that opens in the pre-Google era with a name that no one can spell, pronounce, or remember. How are they ever going to find their way there? So that was the problem with Picholine. So I realized I had to make this logo into a visual mnemonic, a memory aid to help people along just a little bit. So the original logo was actually just the type in this shape of an olive that was sort of the color of an olive also. But then once the restaurant got its 3rd star, everything was upgraded, so we decided to add the olive branch and coordinate it with the menus and the plates at the restaurant. I actually had to send the plate to the printer to have him match the color. So this is very common in the restaurant world. Many restaurateurs can't seem to be bothered to spend any amount of time focusing on the name of their restaurant. They think any old name will do because the logo will make it look good, right? So this was what I call a default name. This was located in the Hotel Metro, so they decided to call it the Metro Grill. Although it could have been worse, because their first choice was to call it Pete's, which is a pretty unsexy name. And the only thing that this restaurant had going for it was, it still is. This is what's interesting. This restaurant is still in business after almost 20 years. And it seems like it's the mediocre restaurants that survive, which is always very interesting. So it still is on a nondescript block in Manhattan, but it happens to be in the garment district. So I decided to work with that theme because there was nothing else to work with. And so I designed the logo, and then we had it made into an actual stitched clothing label. Minimum quantity, 5,000. So I had to find a lot of other uses for it, and fast. So clients like this always like to hear that, oh, this isn't going to cost you anything. So that's what I told them. I said, well, we have these labels, and now we'll just use the remnants from the upholstery fabric for the menus. And of course, they loved that idea until we found out that there were no remnants. But by then it was too late, so I got my way. So remember that pattern from the Wiener Werkstatt? Recognize it here? That's what I love about type and ornament. Like, depending on how it's used and the context, it can take on a whole different mood. So when I got a call about this restaurant, I was very excited because they said Union Pacific, and of course I thought about the railroad and the wonderful posters that they had in the 20s. But no, it had nothing to do with the railroad. It was because it was near Union Square, sort of, not really, and it had neo-Asian cuisine. So I knew immediately that I was going to have to stack the type vertically so that people wouldn't have the same misconception that I had. And then I got to use that pattern again, which the architects used for a cutout metal screen inside the restaurant as well. This was, until recently, in the Grand Central Terminal, and in the balcony just below the beautiful Constellation ceiling in Grand Central. And now it's an Apple store. But it was named after a French train line along the French Riviera. So I decided to make it look like a luggage tag. This was letterpressed on both sides. I like to use letterpress whenever possible with restaurants because that tactile quality, I think, adds to appetite appeal, which is a very important aspect of designing for food. So this was letterpressed on both sides. That was the easy part. But then trying to find somebody to put that little grommet in there with a string was challenging. So this was the same owner as Picholine, another unpronounceable name. Some people seem to think that the way to pronounce this was art is anal. But it's not. So this is actually a French bistro that specializes in cheese. So I wanted it to look like a cheese label, which are usually round, but this was too long a word to fit comfortably around a circle, so we made it into an oval. This was the business card that we printed on a yellow paper stock. And this is another default name. They came to me and said that this restaurant was going to be called 92. Can anybody guess what street it was on? And I started playing around with it, and I realized that a number is pretty difficult to work with at a logo, because you really need to go a little bit further with that. And that's when I started getting into logos that were more like objects, and I found that was a lot more interesting. So on my way up to see the restaurant, the construction site one day, I started really studying the subway mosaics more carefully. And of course, here in Ann Arbor, you may not be expected to know about these mosaics, but these were all done in the early 1900s, and of course, every single number is different because they were all done by hand. So I went back with my camera and I photographed every 9 and every 2 because there is no 92nd Street stop in New York, which you also can't be expected to know. And we photoshopped them together to do this. And what I love about this logo is that it is sort of an insider's joke in New York because there is no 92nd Street stop. But I found that the longer I worked on this logo, the more I became convinced that there really was a 92nd Street stop. And then when I looked at the Photoshop file and I saw that there was this outline layer, I realized that we had our children's menu. So this was given to every kid in the restaurant with a red, yellow, and green crayon. And the client was very happy because he said this will keep them busy for a long time. So remember those plaster letters and that terrible title? Wasn't I happy when I got a call about this new concept? It was a restaurant and cinema. But it turned out that the company that made the plaster letters had gone out of business, so I had to use plastic letters, and I spray painted them and sanded them down to make them a little more imperfect. But these were the menus. I worked with the photographer to do these photo montages, but the dessert menu in the middle is my favorite. Fin. So this was another one called Marseille, and as soon as I heard the name, and it was another French bistro, I knew that it should be done to look like a classic French neon script that you would find in Paris for a cafe. And you saw earlier that I'm a little obsessed with photographing signage, particularly in Europe. So I've been doing it all over Italy for years and years, but also in Paris. And for all it started out with 35 millimeter slides, and then I got into point and shoot prints, and then of course digital. But for all those earlier years, I had these all arranged in binders on a dedicated shelf in my office by city. And they were always just a great source of inspiration for me. They were never meant to be anything more than that, but more about that later. So I took out all my books, and I had a meeting in my office with the owner, the architect, and the sign maker, and we pored over all the images of neon scripts from Paris and decided what type of neon to use. So the idea was that I was going to design the lettering, produce that in vector, that would be given to the sign maker who would make the sign in neon, and then we would photograph the sign illuminated, and that would become the logo. But this, of course, is New York City, and things don't work the way we always want them to work. So they couldn't get the neon sign done in time. So we ended up using the vector art for the menus, which was fine, and I cropped them in different ways depending on which menu it was. But eventually we did get the neon sign, and it's still there, I'm happy to say. And it looks like it belongs in the binders with my other signs. This is one of my favorite Italian restaurants. It happens to be in Seattle, Washington. And it's really great. It's called the Pink Door, and it doesn't have a sign. It just has a pink door. It's very, very successful, but it's a very quirky restaurant. On any given night, there will be a tarot card reader, a cabaret act, and there's always a trapeze act. They have a trapeze in the main dining room, of course. So I wanted to communicate that lively quality in the logo. This was a business card which was printed in letterpress. And this was inspired by my collection of pasticceria papers, which I will show you very shortly. And in the background, I just put in a lot of Italian verbs, like cantare, ballare, divertirsi, festeggiare. So it's like sing, dance, have a good time. And this is technically a default name, but at least it's more elegant than some of the others. It was on the corner of Harrison Street, but as soon as I heard the name of the restaurant, I pictured a letterhead for a 40s hotel. So, and since I'm always a sucker for tapering type to a point, I put this together using some script that I had in my collection that I had found in some headlines in an old movie magazine from the 40s. The same owners came back to me and they said, now we want to open up a restaurant that feels like a seafood shack that you would stumble onto while you're walking along the beach, except that you happen in New England, except that you happen to be in the East Village of New York. So, so for this restaurant, because it was, you know, a little unusual, I wanted to break all the rules. Because from my book jacket days, my mantra always was never illustrate the title. If you show a mermaid, you don't have to say mermaid, right? But in this case, I wanted to. And I would never have dreamed of hyphenating a word in the middle of a logo, but for this, you know, I wanted something just a little more whimsical. So we started with this one, then they opened a sister restaurant, Mermaid Oyster Bar, so we flipped her and put a pearl choker around her neck. But for the first restaurant, I wanted to do something different for the check presenter, because check presenters are so boring. So I said, how about a sardine can? And the clients were a little nervous about that. They said, well, what about if our clients cut themselves on those sharp edges? So I gave them my personal guarantee that I myself would hand paint all the edges of the cans with clear nail polish, which I did. And so they were a big hit, and the New York Times wrote about it. And then after a couple of weeks, they called and they said, we need 24 more. So this time I hired my son. By now he was a teenager. And do you know what it's like to empty out 24 cans of sardines? He's never been able to look at a sardine since. So, but I did the nail polish too and sent them over. Things quieted down again. And then a couple of weeks later, I got the same phone call. So this time, I decided I was going to go down to the restaurant myself to investigate. And this is when I learned that there are two different types of people in the world, and I will prove it to you right now. How many of you, when you walk into an elevator and you press your floor, how many of you press the button once and only once? Raise your hands, if I can see you. You do it more than once. You're the ones who wrecked my check presenter. You know, this never would have occurred to me, but people like you couldn't help themselves from playing with the pull tab. Am I right? Right? So next time you do that, I want you to think about me and but I won't hold it against you. So this is another winner in the unpronounceable restaurant name sweepstakes. This is sfoglia, which means in Italian, sheets of freshly made pasta before it's cut. And the owners already had a restaurant in Nantucket, which is a little island off of Massachusetts. And they wanted to open up one in Manhattan. And at the first meeting, we were talking about logos, and they were interested in the idea of heraldry. And I have a book on heraldry that I always look at when I run out of ideas. And I was looking through it, and I found something that had two mermaids on it. And I thought, oh, that would be interesting. Two islands, Nantucket and Manhattan, two mermaids. So we put this together, and I hired an illustrator, and we put in wheat in their arms and then pasta on the shield. And I always wanted an excuse to design a logo to look like a postage stamp. So this was my moment. So when I had the first meeting with Richard Gere and his wife, I told them the idea about the postage stamp, and I showed some old stamps, and they really liked that idea. And then I said, well, let's talk about imagery. And before I could even say anything, Richard Gere leapt to his feet, and he said, I have this wonderful photograph of my grandfather standing in a wheat field. And then he acted it out, you know, and he said he's standing like this, and he's pushing back the wheat like this, and everybody was transfixed, you know, and then, except his wife, who just rolled her eyes and said, yeah, and you know where that photograph is? And he said, no, I know exactly where it is. So sure enough, the next day, they emailed me the photo, and it was exactly what I expected. It was a small, gray, grainy, blurry snapshot. But that's why we have illustrators, right? So I hired Mark Summers, who's an illustrator I've worked with many times, who does beautiful scratchboard work. And I gave him the whole layout, and he did it in scratchboard. And then I showed them 4 different color options for the stamps, but for the business cards rather. And they couldn't decide because they liked all of them. So we decided to print all 4 colors and make them into collector's items. So that was good. This was actually the original oyster bar in New York City. It was Mermaid Inn was one of the copycats, which I didn't realize until after the fact. But she had had her restaurant for 15 years and never had a logo. And by her 15th anniversary, she decided that she needed a logo. So before this, all she had was a hanging sign that the sign painter had done. You know, she like picked out a font from an old Speedball lettering handbook. And so I just decided to make the sign the same black and white that she had, same proportion, but make the sign look like it had been designed by a better than average sign painter. And this one, this is a Provençal restaurant on Fifth Avenue, and the client was actually open to the idea of a wrought iron script sign, which was great. So we kind of started with the sign and then worked backwards to the logo and all the components. And this is in the Village. It's an Italian restaurant named after a street in Italy where one of the owners has a house. So, and these are the coasters. And the menus, we wanted to look like somewhere in between a newspaper and an almanac. And they fit very nicely in the back pocket of these special chairs that they ordered from England. They're actually chapel chairs, and the pocket is for your Bible, but they use it for a menu instead. So these are the pasticceria papers that I mentioned before. When I was researching the Italian Art Deco book, I found myself one afternoon in a stifling storage room that was filled with cardboard boxes that were each filled with little slips of paper that were all printer's proofs from the 1930s. So needless to say, I was in a very happy place. And that's when I stumbled onto this whole series of these papers that had been used in pastry shops to wrap up the pastries. And they were so incredibly beautiful, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. And that's what really made me want to go into package design. So one of my first clients, fortunately, did all of these Italian imports. Bella Cucina is based in Atlanta, but they have all of these Italian and Mediterranean-inspired products, and no budget for illustration. So these are all engravings from Dover books that I've collected over the years. This was for Jean-Georges von Rechten, who's a very high-profile chef in New York. We did a line of grapeseed oils for him. That was the first time I ever printed on metal, which was very scary, but it was okay. But a lot of what I do in food packaging tends to be makeovers, because usually when a food producer first starts out, they don't have the budget or the know-how to hire a real design firm. They usually just hire a friend of the family or something. And then after, if they're still in business after 5 years, they'll realize that they've reached a point where the quality of their graphics doesn't measure up to the quality of their product. And that's when they call me. So, and what I've learned over the years, and what I always tell clients to try to reassure them, because they're always very nervous about this process. They think they're going to have a completely different design and they're going to lose their customer base. But what I've learned is that you can change a lot as long as you keep one or two key elements. So in this case, it was as simple as keeping the color, sort of, and keeping a rectangle. Except then Tate's was sold for $100 million, and they just changed the packaging. In this case, though, the logo was so bad, I just decided to just start from zero. Their original logo was done by a boat painter. That's a tough act to follow. But they had just a generic bag with all these different stickers on it. So I convinced them, I said, look, let's just print one bag, and then we'll do a whole series of color-coded stickers that will give a lot more information about your coffee. So that worked out well. And then from there, they decided to put their coffee into 3 categories, and we color-coded them as well. And Sarah Beth's had been in business for 25 years with this label that you see on the left. And when I looked at it, I knew that it had been designed by the printer, because why else would it say, if you look under Sarah Beth's, you see it says spread the word. Why else would that be in italics, quotes, and underscored, right? And it says nothing. So first thing was get rid of that line. But she was very nervous, because 25 years is a long time. And I said, look, we're going to keep the same jar. We're going to keep the same oval, and we'll keep your name in upper and lowercase, and we'll upgrade everything. And it made a huge difference. It's a better illustration, a better typography, we changed the lid from fake gold to silver. And what happened was that people were still buying it. A lot of customers probably might not have even noticed right away that it was a different design, but they suddenly had a higher regard for the product. And that's what a good makeover is all about. So then we did American Spoon, Michigan's own. They're great product, very nice people to work with in Petoskey. And they had also been in business for 25 years, like Sarah Beth, making jam, but very different company. It's a family business. They're in northern Michigan, and for them, it's all about the fruit. They have a personal relationship with all their growers. So if the black raspberry crop isn't good one year, they don't make the jam. And I really wanted to communicate that in the logo. So I hired a British illustrator who does wood engravings. He's the one who did Artisanal also, to do this illustration of a man shaking fruit out of a tree. So, and that was used on the lid that you'll see in a second. And then I hired another British illustrator to do these botanicals, and for all the different labels. So what I found interesting is that it took 2 British illustrators to convey this very American brand. There it is on the lid. Then another jam company came along. I'm very happy to say that my next project is going to be peanut butter. So finally, finally it all comes together. So Bonnie's had been, was also different because she makes her jam in small batches. It really tastes like homemade. It's very good. Very artisan. And she had been designing the label herself with a free font. Can you tell? So, but her sentiments were right. She said that she wanted it to feel like a jar of jam that you would buy at a market in the south of France, and some French grandmother wrote it with her own handwriting. So I said, okay, we'll keep it with handwriting, but we'll design a font just for you that's based on handwriting samples that I found from the 40s. So here's the line of her jams. Then we did this gelato logo, and it's very nice having a gelato client, I have to say. But I did, when I first met the owner, I said I would never walk into a gelateria with a logo like that. And once again, I was inspired by those pasticceria papers. I wanted something nostalgic, because everybody loves gelato. And I have a rule in the studio, whenever I do a client presentation, I always schedule it for the afternoon. I serve gelato first, then I show the logo. And it always works. So I also have a deal with this client that whenever I give a lecture in the New York City area, he always caters it. I'm sorry he couldn't come here today. But I think it's too cold for gelato today. And then this was used on all of their various packaging. They have these carts all over the city and on the High Line. And then they brought over this vintage Fiat Cinquecento from Sicily. So the only thing better than having a gelato client is having 2 gelato clients. And this one is from Maine and makes equally good gelato, but this also really illustrates why I love doing makeovers, because it gives me enormous satisfaction to clean up after someone else's mess. And this has got to be the worst ever. You know, gelato in a takeout salad container. I mean, but the only thing that they were doing right was that they had it in a clear container so you could see the beautiful colors. So that was the first thing. I said, let's put it in a nicer container, but let's just really show off the colors. And that's one of the reasons why the label is in the shape it is, so you can see more of the product. So this got them into Whole Foods, which was nice. And this is what the freezer looks like on a typical day in my studio. So this was the first organic cracker on the market, and the client was into the idea of a vintage-looking package, which surprised me. So I had a lot of reference in my studio from old cracker packaging, and so everything on this package was hand lettered, even the net weight. But of course, what you see in stores now is not, because we had an amicable divorce. But that's okay. It was good while it lasted. And this is an interesting lesson in package design. This was done for the El Paso Chili Company many years ago, but it was sold exclusively in Williams-Sonoma. For the 9 years that it was sold there, every year, these were the #1 and 2 best-selling products in the store. which I find fascinating because the margarita salt that you see in the center represents 12 cents worth of salt that they sold for $7. What does that tell you about the power of package design? So this was a line of teas that I did for Marcus Samuelsson, who's a chef in New York, originally from Ethiopia, but raised in Sweden, so this represents his journey. And originally it was supposed to be just tea from Ethiopia, and I was looking for Ethiopian patterns, and there are none because they were too poor to have patterns. So I kind of had to make one up and then just through color do variations. And then, of course, as it turned out, they opened it up to beyond Ethiopia, so that was just as well. And there's always something good to drink in the studio also. These are a number of Italian wines that I've done that for each of them, I wanted them to look like miniature posters, all based on Italian poster design from the early 1900s. Same with these. Sfida on the left was aptly named because that means challenge in Italian, and that's exactly what it was to do this label, because it had to be in a very specific size and proportion, and we had to fit all that copy on there. So, and this is wine that's made in Maine, and I did this a very long time ago, and they're still producing it, but you know what? In Maine, you can't grow grapes. It's colder than it is here. But this was a young couple that was determined to make wine in Maine. So they made it from every fruit except the grape, which was fun for me because I started looking around for botanicals. And I found a whole series of botanicals that were done by the New York State Department of Agriculture in 1910 that had every fruit I needed, even loganberries, but no blueberries. And they had to be wild blueberries on top of that. So I ended up, and this was a long time ago, this was also pre-Photoshop. So I ended up picking wild blueberries up in the country, racing them back to the city, having them photographed in black and white, and then bringing them to my retoucher to airbrush in the color. But they end up looking like the rest of the series. And this is the same client who recently made a rum with organic molasses. So every now and then we do things that are not food related, but they're not nearly as fun. But this was a monogram for Tiffany. They wanted something that could be used as small as the winder of a man's watch or as big as a construction shed. So that was challenging. And these are some publishers that I've done logos for. This is Echo, which is a division of HarperCollins, and Hyperion, which is the publishing arm of Disney. Biella is an Italian hosiery maker, as is Ilux, and in both cases I convinced them, rather than using paper labels for their socks like everybody else does, I said, why don't you use woven labels, because I have a source for that. And even though it was a little more expensive, it really made a big difference. And this was the first watch face I ever designed. It was fun. And I'm sure all the women in the audience are familiar with Hanky Panky intimately. This is my dentist. He's actually a very high-end dentist on Madison Avenue who has all this state-of-the-art equipment, but the best thing of all is that you get a complimentary foot massage with every visit. So that's a way to keep you in the chair. So I decided he needed a really classy logo. And not only that, he needed a better than average reminder card, because there's nothing worse than getting a reminder card from your dentist, right? This is a monogram for Crane Paper. Their mill is located on the Housatonic River, so I wanted to have those concentric seas suggest the ripples of water. And I'm sure some of you have gotten invitations or cards from Paperless Post. This is a very high-end contractor in New York, and I really wanted to make this look like those old wooden rulers that fold up and have brass edging. So not only did the client know what I was talking about, she actually had one, which was very helpful to work with. So a couple of years ago, I was asked to redesign the Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval for their 100th anniversary. And they showed me, roughly every 10 years or so, the seal had been redesigned. And you can see that the first one in 1909 was the best one, ending with, on the lower right-hand corner, everything that we would like to forget about design in the 1990s, right? So once again, this was a no-brainer. Keep the oval and keep the star, right? But I wanted to make it just look like it had always been around. So this is what we came up with. And it was unveiled on the Today Show. I missed this, but apparently there was a mix-up. So they showed mine as the old one, and this one is the new one. But it was okay, because I wanted mine to look like it had always been around. So I used to do a lot of work for The Little Book Room, which is a publisher that do specialized travel guides. And she asked me to do a guidebook to Florence. And I said, well, I am neither a shopper nor am I a writer. And that didn't seem to be of concern to her. So it doesn't take much to get me on a plane to Italy to interview shopkeepers in Italian and taste test gelato. And I had to take pictures of all the shops. And that was the first edition. This is the second one that just came out recently. And then after that first edition, I did this book, Italianissimo, which the only way I can describe this is that it's all the things that we love and sometimes love to hate about Italy. Mostly love, of course. Like hand gestures. And but whenever anybody asks me, though, why I never moved to Italy, I always say I can answer that in 3 words. Fare la coda, which means this is the Italians' inability to form a line, which I think is well illustrated in this photograph. I was very honored to be given this assignment for the 150th anniversary of the unification of Italy. Rizzoli decided to republish the 10 great novels that shaped the nation. So this is what I did. These are some more recent books that I've done with Steve. We call this the S series, starting with scripts and then shadow type. Those are those plaster letters. I found a set of them in an antique store after we did the screening room. And stencil, and the next one will be slab. And then this was done for the School of Visual Arts, where I teach. Every year they ask a different instructor to design the senior library, which is a compendium of all the work done by the graduates in graphic design. So I decided to make it into a box of chocolates, of course. And I fooled a lot of people, because those aren't chocolates, that's a book cover. And every summer, Steve and I both teach in a master's workshop in typography in Rome for 2 weeks, which is a really wonderful program. I highly recommend it. This was also for School of Visual Arts. This was a subway poster, and I decided to do it in mosaic tiles because we had done 92, and I thought, oh, we know how to do that. That'll be easy. But you know, doing a 2-digit number is a lot easier than doing a 13-word poster. So, and this was all done in Photoshop, tile by tile. So my staff never wants to hear the word mosaic ever again. But after a 2-month run in the subway, it came above ground. And it was, this was a 38-foot blow up that was on the side of the school building. And it just happened that the yellow arrow pointed not only to the school, but also to my studio, which was nice. So that was the year of the tallest thing I had, or the biggest thing I'd ever designed, and the smallest thing in the largest quantity. This was my first love stamp that's less than an inch tall and was printed in a run of 250 million. And I've yet to find one printed in register. This was the second one, which was printed in register, thankfully. These were both for Valentine's Day. And next year on Valentine's Day, my 3rd love stamp will be coming out. So everything you've seen here tonight and more is in this monograph I did of my work, Elegantissima. Why did I do this book? So that I could do this copyright page. And and Princeton Architectural Press was my publisher, and they were starting a gift line. They wanted to know if I had any ideas, and I said, well, you know, I've always loved collecting Italian pencil boxes, and I love those double-sided pencils that are red on one side and blue on the other. They were actually for teachers to correct homework. But since red and black are my favorite color combination, I decided to do that. They're called Perfetto. Those were followed by colored pencils called Tutti Frutti. And I didn't know this, but apparently there's a big coloring book craze out there. And so the colored pencils are selling very well as a result, which I am very grateful for. So I had mentioned that I've been photographing signs, and once I started photographing digitally and I realized that the quality was getting so much better that I could actually consider doing these as a book, I realized I really had to because the signs were starting to disappear. Ironically, because of the same technology that was making the digital photography so much better, that same technology was making a lot of the signs disappear to be replaced with clumsily crafted signs made out of plastic from free fonts. So I went back to Italy 4 times that year and reshot as many of the signs as I possibly could, and then went looking for more. This was my secret weapon. It's not a selfie stick. This is a telescoping pole, which was great. It gave me what I'd always wanted in life, an extra 3 feet of height. So this was great. It was much better than a tripod. And I went back to Venice to photograph all these mosaics that were on the pavement, and I had to truncate the telescoping pole to do that. But I noticed from the first day, I noticed I was getting really weird reactions from the Venetians. They were all like holding up their arms in mock horror, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. And then I realized that it looked like I was holding a shotgun. So, Americans, you know. So, but I was so happy when I found this one, which I had never photographed before, and it fit the double-page proportion of my book perfectly. So that was followed by this one that's just came out in September of photographs of Paris signs. And unfortunately, a lot of those neon script signs are all disappearing because they don't tend to last more than about 10 or 15 years, and then they get swapped out for uglier ones. So I started focusing more on mosaics because those tend to stay around longer. So once that one was done, I figured I had time to maybe do one more before they all disappeared. So the next one in the works is Barcelona. And I just spent 3 weeks there over Christmas, and one of the signs that I was really looking forward to photographing was this one. I had only seen it in a book, but I was always just in love with this sign, and I couldn't wait to see it in person. So, and whenever I do these books, I do a lot of prep work before I go, and I make maps of all the different neighborhoods so I can find things quickly. And so the day that I went to go look for this sign, I was so excited, I literally ran to the location to see it. And I got there, and this is what I found. That's what I said. And it just broke my heart. I was devastated, and I just couldn't accept it because I really felt like they had just removed it. And so the next day, I was followed around by a reporter from El País, the Spanish newspaper, who ended up doing a little article about this. This is what the article was. And I didn't even remember mentioning this to him about the Fotos Lopez sign, but he wrote about it in the article. And a week later, when I got back to New York, I got an email from the grandson of the original owner of Fotos Lopez, and he said, we read that article and we got very emotional that you wanted to photograph our sign. So if you ever come back to Barcelona, we will remount the sign for you so you can photograph it, which I thought was really great. And so I'm going back just to photograph that sign. Whatever it takes. So, but it was funny that in the newspaper they cropped out my stepladder, which is a very important part of this. So lastly, I'm just going to show you a very short video of an exhibit that I had last year, When I was asked to do an exhibit of my work, I really couldn't imagine doing it any other way than as a series of room environments, where there would be a library with my books, and a kitchen with all my food products, and a restaurant with all the menus and business cards, and then a boudoir with hanky-panky and my love stamps on letters. So here it is. That was not planned. Plaster of Paris gelato. Thank you.